For 20 years, a patch of empty desert outside a small Iranian city held a secret that could have changed the balance of power in the Middle East forever. No embassy knew, no spy agency had confirmed it. The world's inspectors had no idea it existed. Then, in August 2002, one image, pulled from a commercial satellite orbiting hundreds of kilometers above the Earth, tore that secret wide open. What that photo revealed was not a factory. It was not a mine. It was a buried, fortified, and heavily disguised nuclear enrichment facility, hidden in plain sight near the city of Natanz. And once the world saw it, nothing about the Iranian nuclear program could ever be looked at the same way again. This is the story of how one photograph exposed 2 decades of silence, and how that single moment set off a chain reaction that is still shaking the region today, all the way to bunker buster bombs falling on Iranian mountains in our own time. You need to understand how this began, because the mountain that was bombed a few weeks ago did not appear out of nowhere. It was the final chapter of a hunt that started in a parking lot press conference more than 20 years earlier. Let's go back to August 14th, 2002. In a nondescript hotel conference room in Washington, D.C., a spokesman for an Iranian opposition group, the National Council of Resistance of Iran, stood in front of a small crowd of journalists and calmly announced that Iran was secretly building 2 massive nuclear facilities, one near the desert town of Natanz, another near Arak. Most of the reporters in that room had never heard those names before. Intelligence agencies were caught flat-footed. For years, Iran had insisted, publicly and repeatedly, that its nuclear activities were limited, peaceful, and fully declared. This press conference blew that story apart in real time. Here is where things get really strange. When Western intelligence agencies scrambled to check this claim, they did not send in operatives. They did not need to. They turned to something simpler and far more powerful: commercial satellite imagery. Companies had begun selling high-resolution orbital photography to research institutes, and analysts started pulling image after image of the coordinates given by the defectors. What came back on their screens made experienced nuclear analysts go quiet. Buried into the earth at Natanz was a massive underground complex, its roof reinforced, its structure buried under meters of soil and concrete specifically engineered to survive an airstrike. This was not a facility built by accident. This was a facility built to be hidden and to survive being found. Now, I want you to hear this in the words of someone who lived it. A former Iranian nuclear engineer, speaking anonymously years later to Western researchers, described the atmosphere inside the program in those years like this. Workers were told the buildings they worked in did not exist, that if anyone asked, they were building a water pumping station, and that speaking about their real work outside the gates could cost them their freedom, or worse. That is the level of secrecy Iran maintained around Natanz for 2 decades. An entire industrial nuclear enrichment site built underground, staffed by engineers living double lives, hidden from satellites, from journalists, and for years, from the very international body whose job was to track nuclear material across the planet. You will be surprised just how close the world came to never finding out at all. The defectors who exposed Natanz and Arak in that 2002 press conference were not intelligence officers or government insiders with security clearances. They were members of an opposition political movement widely viewed with suspicion by Western governments at the time precisely because of their political agenda against the Iranian regime. For weeks after the announcement, several intelligence agencies treated the claims with real skepticism, wondering whether this was accurate reporting or political theater designed to manufacture a crisis. It was only when independent satellite imagery purchased from commercial providers with no political stake in the outcome matched the coordinates given by the defectors almost exactly that the credibility of the claim became impossible to dismiss. In other words, the single piece of evidence that turned a disputed political accusation into a confirmed international crisis was not a spy, not a whistleblower, testifying under oath, but a photograph taken by a camera in orbit that had never met Iran, never had an opinion about it, and simply reported exactly what was sitting on the ground. So why did Iran choose Natanz, of all places? The answer lies in geology and geography working together in Iran's favor. Natanz sits in a wide desert basin, ringed by hills, far from major population centers, and easily disguised as agricultural or industrial land from a distance. Iranian engineers dug the core of the facility deep into the ground and then buried it under multiple meters of reinforced concrete and packed earth. On the surface, satellite images for years showed almost nothing unusual. A scattering of buildings, some perimeter fencing, what looked like ordinary industrial development. It was only when analysts cross-referenced construction patterns, ventilation shafts, and unusually thick security perimeters that the true purpose of the site became impossible to deny. But Natanz was only the beginning of the story. Once inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency finally gained access in 2003, what they found inside exceeded even the worst assumptions. Long buried halls, designed to eventually house thousands of centrifuges spinning uranium gas, cascading it step by step toward higher and higher levels of enrichment. For a peaceful energy program, this scale made no sense. For a country racing toward a nuclear weapons option, it made perfect sense. This is the exact moment when Iran's decades-long game of deception started colliding with the outside world's ability to actually verify what it was being told. And just when the world thought it had finally mapped the true scope of Iran's ambitions, it was hit with an even bigger shock. In September 2009, Western intelligence agencies revealed the existence of a second, even more secretive enrichment site. This one was not built in open desert. It was carved directly into the side of a mountain near the holy city of Qom. The world would come to know it by its code name, Fordow. Here is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe. Fordow was built so deep inside a mountain, under so many meters of solid rock, that officials openly admitted it was designed specifically to survive an aerial bombardment from conventional weapons. Analysts studying the site's layout concluded that its air defense positions, tunnel structure, and depth were deliberately engineered around one single threat: an airstrike from Israel or the United States. In other words, before the world even confirmed the site existed, Iran had already built it to withstand an attack that hadn't happened yet. When satellite images of Fordow's surface first circulated, they showed almost nothing: a mountain, a road, some fencing, a scattering of support buildings. It was only through defector testimony, cross-referenced with painstaking satellite analysis of tunnel entrances, ventilation shafts, and unusual troop and security movements around the mountain, that the true scale of what was buried inside became clear. For years, Fordow existed as one of the most heavily guarded secrets in the modern nuclear age, a facility built with the explicit assumption that someday someone would try to destroy it from the air. It's worth pausing here to understand exactly how the world's nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, actually operates in a situation like this, because it explains why so much of this story unfolded in slow motion rather than all at once. The agency does not have its own satellites, and it does not have police powers. Its inspectors can only go where a host country agrees to let them go, under access rules negotiated site by site, sometimes clause by clause. Successive directors, general of the agency, have described their relationship with Iran using strikingly similar language across different administrations. Cooperation that was technically compliant with the letter of prior agreements, while falling well short of full transparency in practice. One particularly telling moment came when the agency's leadership publicly stated that Iran's declarations about its nuclear material could not be considered complete or correct. A formal, carefully chosen diplomatic phrase that, translated into plain language, essentially meant, "We do not believe we have been told the whole truth." When the organization, whose entire job is verifying nuclear declarations, starts using language like that, you know the 20-year pattern of hidden sites has done lasting damage to the credibility of the entire process. This is where we need to widen the picture, because Natanz and Fordow were never the whole story. As inspectors and analysts kept pulling on this thread, a third site emerged into the spotlight: Parchin, a sprawling military complex southeast of Tehran. Unlike Natanz and Fordow, Parchin was never presented as an enrichment site. Instead, satellite images and inspector reports pointed to something potentially even more alarming: specialized testing chambers that outside experts believed could be used to study the kind of high explosive detonation techniques relevant to nuclear weapon design, not power generation. For years, Iran restricted international access to Parchin, and when inspectors were finally allowed limited visits, satellite imagery had already shown extensive efforts to scrape, pave over, and rebuild sections of the site beforehand. To outside analysts, this pattern looked less like an accident and much more like a cleanup operation timed just ahead of an inspection. What makes Parchin such a strange case study is the sheer patience involved. Satellite analysts monitoring the site over the years didn't just spot one round of suspicious construction. They documented repeated cycles of it: a building demolished, the ground graded flat, new asphalt poured, entire sections of the surrounding land reshaped, sometimes years apart, always seemingly timed just before international pressure for access reached its peak. Researchers comparing image after image concluded that whatever activity had originally taken place inside those buildings, Iran was willing to spend years and significant resources, making sure nobody could ever fully reconstruct the physical evidence of it. When inspectors were finally granted access to specific locations at Parchin, they were permitted to take environmental samples. But by then, the landscape itself had already been rebuilt so many times that some analysts questioned how much could realistically still be detected. And then there is Arak, the same site named in that original 2002 press conference alongside Natanz. Arak was built around a heavy water reactor, a type of reactor design that, unlike typical civilian power reactors, is particularly well suited to producing plutonium, one of the two paths to a nuclear weapon. Commercial satellite images tracked the construction of Arak's reactor dome and supporting facilities for years before Iran allowed meaningful international oversight of the site. By the time inspectors were able to examine it closely, key design questions about the reactor's true purpose were already the subject of fierce international dispute. Arak eventually became one of the strangest bargaining chips in the entire 20-year saga. As part of the 2015 nuclear agreement, Iran agreed to physically redesign the core of the Arak reactor, pouring concrete into the original calandria, the core structure of the reactor, to make it permanently unusable in its original form, all under the supervision of international observers who documented the process. For a brief moment, this felt like genuine, verifiable progress. A facility that had once been shrouded in secrecy was now being dismantled on camera, piece by piece. But even that moment of transparency didn't last. As the broader agreement collapsed in the years that followed, questions resurfaced about Iran's long-term intentions for heavy water production capacity elsewhere in the country, keeping Arak's story unresolved even after its most dramatic chapter had supposedly closed. And then there is Arak, the same site named in that original 2002 press conference alongside Natanz. Duplicate paragraph in source repeats 8184. Arak was built around a heavy water reactor, a type of reactor design that, unlike typical civilian power reactors, is particularly well suited to producing plutonium, one of the two paths to a nuclear weapon. Commercial satellite images tracked the construction of Arak's reactor dome and supporting facilities for years before Iran allowed meaningful international oversight of the site. By the time inspectors were able to examine it closely, key design questions about the reactor's true purpose were already the subject of fierce international dispute. So now picture the map as a whole. Natanz in the desert. Fordow buried inside a mountain. Parchin, a military site scrubbed clean before inspectors arrived. Arak, a heavy water reactor built along a path that experts warned could lead toward plutonium production. 4 sites, 20 years, one thread connecting them all. A pattern of concealment, discovered again and again, not through Iranian disclosure, but through outside detection, first by defectors, and then by the unblinking eye of satellites in orbit. But here's the detail almost nobody remembers about how the world actually confirmed what was buried at these sites, and it's the most important part of this entire story. Satellite photos alone can show you the shape of a building. They cannot show you what's happening inside it. So for years, the story of Iran's nuclear program was a slow, grinding battle between what could be photographed from orbit and what had to be confirmed on the ground. Inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency were repeatedly delayed, redirected, and denied access to specific buildings within Natanz and Fordow, sometimes for months at a time, giving Iranian technicians a window to clean, repaint, or reconfigure rooms before anyone with a badge and a Geiger counter walked through the door. Every single time this happened, outside analysts would go back to the satellite archives, compare images from before and after the delay, and look for the telltale signs of a cover-up. New pavement where there wasn't any before, roof panels replaced, entire structures demolished and rebuilt in a matter of weeks. This cat-and-mouse game between cameras in orbit and inspectors on the ground became the defining rhythm of the entire 20-year saga. This pattern did not go unnoticed by Iran's neighbors, and it triggered a regional response that is still playing out today. Israel, which considers a nuclear-armed Iran an existential threat, responded with what analysts have described as a shadow war stretched across more than a decade. A computer worm known as Stuxnet, believed to have been developed by American and Israeli intelligence services, was discovered inside Natanz's control systems, quietly destroying centrifuges from within, while operators watched their monitors report that everything was running normally. Several Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated in targeted attacks over the following years. Attacks Iran blamed directly on Israeli intelligence. Mysterious explosions and fires repeatedly struck facilities connected to the program, including Natanz itself, incidents Western analysts widely attributed to covert sabotage rather than accident. And then, in early 2018, came one of the most audacious intelligence operations in modern history. Israeli agents reportedly slipped into a nondescript warehouse in Tehran overnight and walked out with an entire physical archive, tens of thousands of pages and files documenting Iran's past nuclear weapons research. When Israeli officials later presented parts of that archive publicly, the message was blunt. This was not a hypothetical worry about future intentions. This was documented proof that a dedicated weapons research effort had existed, hidden inside the same web of secrecy that produced Natanz and Fordow in the first place. Whatever you believe about how that archive was obtained, its existence turned the abstract argument over Iran's intentions into a much harder conversation about its actual documented history. By July 2020, the Shadow War produced one of its strangest chapters yet. A mysterious explosion tore through a centrifuge assembly building at Natanz, an incident Iranian officials initially tried to downplay before satellite images circulating within days showed the true scale of the destruction. A scorched, partially collapsed structure that outside experts estimated could set back centrifuge production by months, if not longer. Iran quietly acknowledged sabotage without naming who was responsible, though most Western analysts had little doubt. The site that had once been hidden from the entire world was now being watched so closely by so many satellites and so many intelligence services that even an act of sabotage against it became a matter of public record within days. Iran's Gulf neighbors watched all of this with their own quiet alarm. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf states have never fully trusted Iran's public assurances about the peaceful nature of its program, and the repeated discovery of hidden sites only deepened that distrust. Saudi officials have stated publicly, on multiple occasions, that if Iran ever crosses the threshold to a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia will feel compelled to pursue its own. That single sentence, repeated by Saudi leadership over the years, is the clearest sign of just how destabilizing this 2-decade pattern of hidden nuclear infrastructure has become for the entire region. Turkey watched from a slightly different angle, caught between its NATO membership and its complicated, often transactional relationship with Tehran. Turkish officials have generally avoided the kind of blunt public statements Saudi Arabia has made, but internal Turkish policy discussions, reported over the years by regional analysts, have repeatedly flagged the same underlying anxiety. A nuclear-capable Iran would fundamentally reshape the balance of power across the entire Middle East, and no neighboring state, regardless of its alliances, could afford to simply ignore that shift. Even Egypt, sitting further from the immediate region but historically wary of any single power dominating Middle Eastern security dynamics, has echoed similar concerns through its own diplomatic channels at the United Nations over the years. What ties all of these neighboring reactions together is not just fear of a bomb. It's the deeper realization, shared from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi to Ankara, that if a country can build and hide 2 entire nuclear enrichment complexes, one buried in the desert and one carved into solid rock, for the better part of 2 decades, then the entire regional assumption of transparency and verification is fundamentally broken. Once that trust breaks in a region already thick with rivalries, it doesn't just stay contained to one country's nuclear ambitions. It pushes every neighbor to start quietly asking whether they need their own insurance policy too. While Israel was running a shadow war and the Gulf states were quietly rattled, 2 other major powers were watching this entire saga unfold from a very different angle: Russia and China. Both countries maintained civil nuclear cooperation with Iran throughout this entire period, with Russian engineers helping build and maintain Iran's Bushehr power reactor, even as the Natanz and Fordow revelations rocked the diplomatic world. At the United Nations, Russia and China repeatedly softened or delayed the toughest proposed sanctions against Iran, arguing that isolating Tehran completely would only push it further outside the reach of international oversight altogether. Critics in Washington and European capitals saw this as Moscow and Beijing shielding a client state from consequences. Russian and Chinese officials framed it instead as pragmatic engagement, keeping a channel of dialogue open rather than slamming every door shut. Either way, this 3-way tug of war between Western pressure, Russian and Chinese diplomatic cover, and Iran's own domestic hardliners is exactly why 2 decades of exposure never actually produced a clean, final resolution. Now let's bring in the diplomatic side of this story, because it explains why simple sanctions and statements were never enough to stop what was happening underground. Mark Fitzpatrick, a longtime nuclear non-proliferation analyst who has spent years studying Iran's program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, has long argued that the discovery of Fordow was the single moment that convinced Western governments Iran could not be taken at its word on any nuclear declaration, no matter how detailed. According to Fitzpatrick's analysis, once a state is caught building a second secret enrichment site after already being caught once, every future claim of peaceful intent has to be treated as unverified until satellite and inspector evidence proves otherwise. That distrust shaped years of negotiations. In 2015, after nearly 2 years of grinding diplomacy, Iran and a group of world powers signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, an agreement that placed strict limits on enrichment levels, centrifuge numbers, and stockpiles, all in exchange for sanctions relief. For a few years, it appeared the pattern of hidden expansion had finally been contained through negotiation rather than sabotage. But in 2018, the United States withdrew from that agreement entirely, arguing it had failed to address Iran's ballistic missile program and did not permanently close the pathway to a bomb. Iran responded by steadily abandoning the deal's restrictions itself, expanding enrichment levels far beyond what the agreement had allowed, and reducing the access international inspectors were given to its facilities. This is exactly the moment where the story catches up to the headlines you have been seeing recently. As Iran's enrichment levels climbed, and as inspectors were repeatedly blocked or delayed from key sites, alarm bells rang louder in Washington, Jerusalem, and European capitals alike. By the middle of the last decade, watchdog reports were confirming that Iran had accumulated stockpiles of uranium enriched to levels with no plausible civilian justification, levels that international monitors repeatedly flagged as dangerously close to weapons-grade material. This is the exact backdrop against which the strikes you may have already seen footage of, tens of thousands of pounds of ordnance falling on mountains housing facilities like Fordow, finally happened. Those bombs were not a random escalation. They were the culmination of more than 20 years of concealment, discovery, negotiation, and broken trust, all traced back to that first satellite photograph in 2002. Think about the sheer strangeness of that timeline for a moment. A press conference in a Washington hotel in 2002. A satellite photo confirming a buried desert facility. A second, even deeper facility found hidden inside a mountain 7 years later. A decade of stolen archives, exploding centrifuges, and assassinated scientists. A landmark diplomatic agreement signed, then abandoned. And finally, more than 20 years after that first photograph, actual bunker buster munitions, dropping on the very mountain that had been built specifically to survive exactly that kind of attack. Few stories in modern geopolitics have such a direct, traceable line from a single piece of paperwork evidence to an actual battlefield outcome 2 decades later. And the diplomatic maneuvering did not stop once the bombs fell. European governments, led by the same 3 powers who helped negotiate the original 2015 agreement, Britain, France, and Germany, had spent the prior months warning Tehran that its refusal to fully cooperate with inspectors could trigger what's known as the snapback mechanism, a legal process built into the old nuclear agreement that allows expired United Nations sanctions to be automatically reimposed if Iran is found in serious violation. Iranian officials publicly dismissed the threat as diplomatic theater. It wasn't. When European governments formally triggered the process, it forced the reinstatement of sweeping international sanctions that had been suspended for nearly a decade. Sanctions covering arms transfers, missile technology, and financial transactions across the board. For a regime already reeling from military strikes on its most protected nuclear infrastructure, the return of those sanctions closed off financial breathing room at the worst possible moment. It's worth remembering just how differently this could have unfolded. Nuclear history is full of examples where diplomacy actually worked. Libya voluntarily dismantled its own secret weapons program in 2003 after quiet negotiations with the United States and Britain, trading its nuclear ambitions for reintegration into the international community. South Africa, remarkably, built actual nuclear weapons in the 1980s and then dismantled every single one of them voluntarily as apartheid ended, submitting to full international verification in the process. Both of those cases stand in stark contrast to what happened with Iran, where every major disclosure came from the outside rather than from Tehran itself. Analysts studying nonproliferation across decades have repeatedly pointed to this exact distinction as the difference between a program that ends peacefully and one that ends, as we've now seen with Iran, in airstrikes, sabotage, and reimposed sanctions. Voluntary transparency diffuses a crisis. Concealment, once exposed, tends to guarantee one. David Albright, founder of the Institute for Science and International Security, and one of the most cited nuclear satellite imagery analysts in the world, has spent much of his career studying exactly this pattern. Based on years of his published analysis, the consistent lesson from Natanz, Fordow, and Parchin is simple. Iran has never voluntarily disclosed a major nuclear site before it was independently exposed. Every single major facility in Iran's program became public knowledge only because someone outside the Iranian government, a defector, a satellite operator, or an inspector working around Iranian restrictions, found it first. That single fact has driven Western nuclear policy toward Iran for more than 2 decades, and it is exactly why so much of the current standoff has come down to bombs, sabotage, and satellites rather than treaties and trust. There's one more piece of this story that rarely makes it into the headlines, and it might be the most human part of all. Families of the Iranian scientists and engineers who spent their careers inside Natanz and Fordow have almost never spoken publicly, for obvious reasons. But over the years, a handful of accounts have leaked out through human rights researchers and journalists working with the Iranian diaspora, describing a strange, quietly tragic existence. Engineers recruited straight out of top Iranian universities, given prestigious salaries and housing, and then effectively sealed off from ordinary civilian life, unable to discuss their work with friends, unable to travel freely, and in several documented cases, unable to protect themselves when they became targets of assassination attempts, specifically because of the work they were assigned to. Whatever you believe about the strategic necessity of the program itself, the individual human cost paid by the engineers caught inside this secrecy machine is rarely part of the conversation, and it probably should be. There's also a financial dimension to this story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Building and maintaining facilities like Natanz and Fordow, buried under meters of rock and concrete, protected by dedicated air defense batteries, staffed by specially recruited engineers living under strict secrecy protocols, is not cheap. Independent economic analysts studying Iran's defense and nuclear spending over the years have estimated that the country poured billions of dollars into this infrastructure during a period when its broader economy was simultaneously being squeezed by international sanctions, currency collapse, and rising domestic inflation. Ordinary Iranian citizens, dealing with shortages and a shrinking currency, were in many cases entirely unaware of just how much national wealth was being funneled into deeply buried enrichment halls their own government refused to acknowledge existed. When protests over economic conditions have flared up inside Iran in recent years, some demonstrators have explicitly pointed to this exact contradiction. A government insisting it could not afford basic economic relief for its own population, while simultaneously funding some of the most expensive underground military engineering projects on the planet. Let's go back to where we started. That first satellite photo of Natanz, quietly analyzed by researchers in 2002, sitting on a desk far from the desert it depicted. At the time, almost no one outside a small circle of nuclear specialists understood what they were looking at. Today, that same patch of desert and the mountain complex that followed it near Qom have become the center of one of the most dangerous standoffs on the planet, a story that has pulled in Israeli intelligence operations, American bunker buster bombs, Gulf state nuclear threats of their own, and years of failed and broken diplomacy. 20 years of secrecy. 2 decades of buried concrete, disguised buildings, and workers told to lie about their own jobs. All of it eventually undone, piece by piece, not by an army, but by the patient, unblinking eye of a camera in orbit, and by the handful of people willing to risk everything to say what they had seen on the ground. Iran built an empire of hidden concrete and steel meant to survive any attack thrown at it from above. Instead, it built a monument to exactly how hard it is to keep a secret buried underground when the whole world is watching from space. And here is the part of the story that should genuinely unsettle you, no matter which side of this conflict you find yourself sympathizing with. The technology that exposed Natanz in 2002 was primitive by today's standards, grainy commercial satellite photography that took analysts weeks to properly interpret. Today, commercial imaging satellites can capture updated photos of almost any point on Earth multiple times per day, with resolution sharp enough to identify individual vehicles, count personnel movements, and detect fresh construction within hours of it happening. Open source researchers, independent analysts, and hobbyist satellite trackers, scattered across universities and private research groups worldwide, now do in an afternoon what once took defector testimony and years of quiet intelligence work to accomplish. And that means the era of a state successfully hiding a facility the size of Natanz or Fordow for 2 full decades may genuinely be coming to a close. Not because governments have gotten better at cooperating, but because the sky itself has gotten far too crowded with cameras for anything that large to stay hidden for long. Which raises the real question hanging over everything you just watched. If Iran's entire 20-year strategy of concealment, deep tunnels, disguised buildings, buried concrete, has ultimately ended not in a secure deterrent, but in bombed mountains, assassinated scientists, exploded centrifuges, and reimposed sanctions, what does that actually tell us about the future of nuclear secrecy anywhere on the planet? Every government now watching this unfold, whether in Pyongyang, in regional capitals across the Middle East, or anywhere else with ambitions of its own, is absorbing the exact same lesson Iran just learned the hard way. In an age of orbital cameras circling the Earth every 90 minutes, there may no longer be such a thing as a secret buried deep enough to stay buried forever. Thank you for watching. If this story shocked you the way it shocked us researching it, make sure to like this video and drop a comment with your take. It genuinely helps this analysis reach more people who need to understand what's really happening in Iran right now. We'll keep tracking every new development as it unfolds.